My name is Harper Wainwright, and I'm 63 years old. I've always been a woman of quiet determination, the kind of person who can endure a long shift and still find the energy to bake a pie from scratch just to see a smile on the face of someone I love. That someone was my son, Daniel. When he was small, his brown eyes wide with wonder at the simplest of things. I remember one particular Thanksgiving vividly, though every year was etched in my memory like a delicate painting. Our apartment was cramped, the kind of place where the kitchen and living room seemed to bleed into each other, and our rent consumed nearly every penny I earned from my 2 jobs. Still, none of that mattered on Thanksgiving morning. The apartment smelled of cinnamon and roasting chicken, and the air felt electric with anticipation. I hummed along with the old radio peeling potatoes until my fingers ached carefully, basting the bird so that it would turn golden brown in the oven. Daniel sat perched on the counter, his chin resting in his small hands, eyes following my every movement. "It smells like magic, Mom," he said, his voice filled with awe. I laughed, the sound warm and real echoing off the walls lined with thrift store furniture and secondhand curtains. In that moment, I could almost forget the bills stacked in the corner, the shoes with worn soles, the long nights I spent scrubbing floors and serving tables. Everything outside those 4 walls ceased to exist. All that mattered was the glow in my son's face. Even when my knees throbbed from hours on them kneading dough or mopping the kitchen floor, I pressed on. Daniel helped where he could, folding napkins into crooked triangles and dragging chairs into place for our small, uneven table. We didn't have crystal glasses or silverware that shone, but we had laughter. We had stories of pilgrims and gratitude that flowed from our hearts rather than our pockets. Every year, the tradition grounded us, offering a fragile kind of magic that nothing outside could touch. I'd wake before dawn, rubbing my eyes, and feel the chill of the apartment on my skin. But I never complained. The world beyond our windows could be harsh and unyielding, but inside, we created warmth. Daniel's wide-eyed curiosity made every scrape, every burn, every sleepless night worth it. It wasn't just a meal, it was a ceremony of love, a reminder that despite everything, we had each other. As I slide my hands over the countertop, now remembering those mornings, I can almost hear his small laugh again, carrying across the tiny apartment, weaving through the smell of roasted chicken and sweet pie. Those memories linger like the scent of cinnamon, stubborn and comforting. They remind me of a time when joy was simple and love was tangible, measured in the care poured into mashed potatoes and perfectly browned pie crusts. And yet, as the years have passed, I can feel the distance that has grown between us, a quiet reminder that love sometimes requires more than magic to survive. The alarm always seemed cruel, ringing before the sun had even climbed above the rooftops. At 23, I had already learned how to move through exhaustion with quiet determination, and decades later, the memory of those mornings still clung to me like a stubborn shadow. I worked 2 jobs, cleaning offices at dawn and serving tables until the late hours. Each night, I returned to our small apartment with aching muscles and tired hands. But the thought of Daniel waiting for me, hungry, eager, and full of life, made every ache bearable. I can still see him sitting on the edge of the sofa, small legs swinging a little blanket draped over his shoulders, eyes wide as I unpacked the groceries. Even when money was scarce and the pantry nearly empty, I found ways to make each meal feel like a celebration. Thanksgiving was always my sacred rebellion against the hardship that followed us all year. I would stretch my meager earnings buying a small chicken instead of a turkey, peeling each potato by hand until my fingers burned, and carefully folding napkins into imperfect triangles, just as I had shown Daniel when he was little. The apartment smelled of cinnamon and roasting chicken of butter, melting into golden mashed potatoes, and of pumpkin pie cooling on the counter, its crust flaky despite my fatigue. I sang softly to myself as I worked little tunes that had no words, just rhythms, to keep time with the chopping and stirring. Daniel would hum along, mimicking my songs with squeaky little tones, and I would pause to watch him, seeing the wonder in his eyes. It was a small victory, a reminder that even in scarcity, we could create warmth. Even when the nights were long and the money ran thinner than ever, I refused to let despair dictate our traditions. I remember scrubbing floors with hands raw from cleaning office tiles, elbows deep in soapy water, just to make sure Daniel had a clean home to return to. I poured myself a cup of instant coffee when I got home often, forgetting to drink it until the last sip burned my throat. And then I would set to preparing the simple feast I promised myself he would have. There were no luxuries, no silver cutlery, no elegant dishes, but the love infused each plate, each carefully prepared dish. I watched Daniel scoop spoonfuls of mashed potatoes, sprinkle a pinch of salt, and grin at the first bite of chicken. I watched him take that small piece of pumpkin pie crust, crumbling in his eager fingers, and I felt a rush of quiet triumph. It wasn't wealth that mattered, nor comfort, nor recognition from the world. It was this moment of joy, fleeting but real, that made the exhaustion, the sacrifices, and the lonely nights worth enduring. I never spoke of the nights I slept with my coat on, counting pennies until the next paycheck, or the times I wore the same shoes for 3 winters in a row because Daniel needed a new pair. All that mattered was that he never knew that the magic of our Thanksgiving traditions remained intact, pure and untarnished. And so I worked and baked and stirred each action, a promise I had made to myself long ago. No matter how small our means, my son would always have a home full of warmth and love. Even now, thinking back, I can feel the ache of those years in my bones, a testament to the quiet persistence of a mother's devotion. Every labor, every long day, every sacrifice was a stitch in the fabric of our lives, woven so tightly that no hardship could unravel the bond between us. Even in the smallest moments, Daniel had a way of turning our tiny apartment into a place that felt larger than life. I remember him sitting cross-legged on the living room floor, coloring outside the lines, the crayons scattered like confetti. He would look up at me with wide eyes every time I carried a tray of warm bread or a slice of pumpkin pie across the room, and his expression alone could make the exhaustion of the day disappear. One afternoon, I had just finished peeling potatoes and stirring a pot of gravy when Daniel tugged at my apron. "Mom, tell me the story about the Pilgrims again," he begged, his voice high and eager. I paused, resting a hand on my hip, and smiled at his insistence. I had told that story countless times, but his wonder never wavered. I began letting my voice rise and fall like the rhythm of the waves outside our window. He hung on every word, eyes wide, imagining the long journey across the ocean, the hardships, the courage of strangers in a new land. He laughed at the little missteps I added, the tiny flourishes, to keep the story lively. And as he laughed, I felt a warmth that no paycheck or promotion could ever bring. Those moments were fleeting, yes, but they were solid as stone in my memory, anchored by the love I poured into them and the joy reflected back at me. Even when the apartment felt cramped, the heat of the stove filling the room, the small wonders of our shared rituals transformed everything. During Thanksgiving, the magic intensified. I would let Daniel help where he could, even if his hands were too small for practical use. He stirred the pie filling with exaggerated care, spilling some on the counter, and I would wipe it up while he watched, beaming at his own contribution. We folded napkins together, crooked triangles that somehow became ceremonial in his eyes. He would hum little songs I had made up, and we would laugh at how silly the notes sounded when he tried to mimic me. Each sound, each clumsy gesture became part of a language only we shared, a secret thread weaving us together. I would glance at him sitting on the counter or leaning against the table and marvel at how full his face seemed with delight. He didn't care that our furniture was mismatched, that the chairs wobbled, or that the floor was worn and scratched. His world was complete, and I was its center. That sense of completeness, fragile as it was, made all the long nights, all the aches and exhaustion, feel like a small price to pay. Even when the bills piled up, when I had to stretch my paycheck to cover groceries and rent, those little pockets of joy held me upright. Daniel's laughter and wonder were like fuel, keeping me moving through the monotony and fatigue. He was the reason I could scrub floors until my hands throbbed, the reason I could stand at the stove for hours, and the reason the simplest of our Thanksgiving meals felt like a grand celebration. I remember feeling even then that these small joys were building something that would last long after the food was eaten, long after the dishes were washed, long after the scent of roasted chicken had faded from the apartment. It was in these moments that I learned the quiet power of love, the way simple happiness could anchor a bond that no hardship could break. Daniel's childhood joy was the brightest proof that all my sacrifices had meaning, a living reminder that even in scarcity, love could flourish. Time has a way of slipping past quietly until one day you look up and realize everything has changed. Daniel grew up faster than I could ever imagine, leaving behind the small rituals and cramped apartment that had once defined our world. He graduated high school with the same bright curiosity that had filled his childhood, and I watched hands wrinkled and tired from years of labor as he stepped confidently into the wider world. College came next, and with it came late nights filled with research papers and borrowed books, the kind of nights where I barely slept. Working extra shifts just to make sure his tuition was covered and his dorm room stocked with necessities. I remember eating peanut butter sandwiches in the dim light of our apartment while he stayed up determined to finish a project. The sacrifices never felt like burden. When I saw the fire in his eyes, the same spark that had made Thanksgiving mornings radiant with joy. Then came Emily. She appeared in his life quietly, with a warm smile and steady confidence that immediately made him lighter somehow, as if the weight of adulthood was suddenly more bearable. Harper watched from the edges of photographs and hurried weekend visits, learning Emily's routines and habits, her careful attention to detail, the way she folded napkins with precise corners and polished the silverware until it shone. Daniel was happy, undeniably happy, and my heart ached and swelled at the same time. The first time Emily invited me to their new home in Portland, I was struck by its elegance. The walls were painted soft hues, the hardwood floors gleamed under modern lighting, and the kitchen was outfitted with appliances I could only have dreamed of during those years of scarcity. It was everything I had hoped Daniel would have, and yet as I stepped over the threshold, I felt the subtle distance that had begun to grow between us. The place was warm, yes, but I was an outsider here, a relic of a life that no longer existed. I watched Daniel and Emily move through the rooms with ease, sharing quiet looks and gentle laughter, the kind that belongs to a couple secure in their life together. Their domestic harmony was a stark contrast to the small chaos of our old apartment, where every item had been rearranged a dozen times, and joy was a careful balance of effort and necessity. I felt a pang of nostalgia mixed with unease, a quiet tension that I could not ignore. Even in this beautiful home, the rhythms of family had shifted. Where Daniel once turned to me for guidance or companionship, he now leaned on Emily, deferring to her instincts in ways that made me feel my voice had grown smaller. I smiled when he looked my way, offered a joke or a helping hand, but I couldn't escape the sense that the center of his world had moved elsewhere, and in some small, unspoken way, I understood that it was supposed to. He was grown. He had his own family, but understanding didn't ease the sting and the memories of long, tireless years of meals. Cooked floors, scrubbed nights endured, made the reality of my shrinking place all the more vivid. I found myself lingering in corners, observing instead of participating, remembering every Thanksgiving, every bedtime story, every moment of quiet laughter shared over bowls of mashed potatoes. Those memories were mine, stitched together from sacrifice and devotion. Yet here I was, feeling peripheral in the life I had worked so hard to give him. And still beneath the ache, there was pride. Pride in the man he had become, in the warmth and love he had found. It was the kind of pride that didn't erase the loneliness, but it gave me something to hold on to as I stepped further into a home that was no longer entirely mine. The taxi pulled up in front of Daniel and Emily's house, a sleek, modern building tucked into a quiet Portland neighborhood lined with maple trees. I clutched the jar of homemade cranberry sauce in my hands, wrapped carefully in a kitchen towel. The label I had written in my neat, slightly shaky handwriting read simply, "For Thanksgiving." My palms were warm, but my stomach fluttered with a mixture of pride and apprehension. Emily opened the door before I could ring the bell. She smiled all polished ease and effortless grace and took the jar from me without hesitation. "Harper, thank you. You didn't have to." She began, her tone polite, almost formal, and I felt a pang I hadn't expected. It was a kindness, yes, but it came with distance, a reminder that this home was their life now, not mine. Daniel appeared behind her, his coat still dusted with autumn leaves from his morning run. "Mom," he said, voice warm, and he hugged me with a strength I remembered from childhood. His laughter was familiar, but the space between us already felt subtly different. I smiled and returned his embrace, careful not to let my unease show. The inside of the house was breathtaking. Hardwood floors gleamed like polished amber, soft light spilled from recessed ceiling fixtures, and the kitchen sparkled with appliances I had only seen in magazines. I stepped inside, feeling the cold veneer of perfection press lightly against my chest. It was beautiful, every detail chosen, every surface immaculate, but it wasn't ours. This was Daniel and Emily's life, and I was stepping into it as a guest. I followed them through the open floor plan, trying to keep my movements natural. Daniel introduced me to a few of Emily's friends who had already arrived, all smiles and casual conversation. Their voices blended into a soft hum as I set the jar carefully on the counter. I could smell the roasting turkey, sweet potatoes, and pumpkin pie, familiar scents that somehow felt foreign here. Emily gestured to the dining room. "You can put it over there," she said. Her hands, manicured and precise, barely touched the jar. It felt ceremonial and distant at once. I nodded, placing it on the polished sideboard, careful not to let my hands shake. Every surface gleamed under the chandelier, every chair aligned perfectly, and I felt myself shrinking in the vast, elegant space. Daniel leaned close, whispering, "Everything okay?" I nodded again, smiling softly. But the truth was that I felt like a shadow in a house filled with light. The familiarity of my old kitchen-worn countertops, crooked chairs, and the warm chaos of our Thanksgiving preparations was gone. Here, every corner whispered order and success, and I was reminded that the life I had built for him, full of love and careful sacrifice, existed now only in memories. Still, as I followed them to the dining room, I reminded myself of why I was here. The cranberry sauce was a small piece of tradition, a thread connecting past and present. I had made it from scratch, simmering the berries, slowly adding just enough sugar, stirring until the aroma filled our tiny kitchen. It was meant to carry the warmth of all the Thanksgivings we had shared, a reminder that no matter how much time had passed, some things endure. I set the jar on the table, stepping back to observe the scene. The space was beautiful, orderly, almost serene, but my heart carried the weight of years, the long nights, the hard work, the tiny hands reaching up to mine, full of trust and wonder. I took a breath and straightened my shoulders. I was here. I belonged to this moment, even if only as a witness to how far our lives had stretched. The dining room was alive with chatter, laughter, and the clinking of glasses. The smell of roasted turkey, sweet potatoes, and fresh bread filled every corner, warm and comforting, yet it carried with it a subtle sting. I had spent hours preparing the cranberry sauce, carefully simmering it to a rich, deep red, and yet now it sat on the sideboard, almost forgotten, as Emily and her parents, Mrs. and Mr. Reynolds, took their places at the head of the table. Daniel approached with a carving knife in hand, his movements confident and practiced. He had always handled a turkey like it was a sacred object, and I had expected him to do the same for me, as he had when he was small. He carved the breast with precision, placing thick, juicy slices onto the plates of his father, Emily, and his in-laws. Each piece was adorned with sprigs of rosemary and served with care, the kind of attention I had once lavished on him. When it was my turn, Daniel hesitated for just a moment, his hand hovering over the plate, before he set a small, uneven slice onto a saucer scraps that had been trimmed from the edges. My fingers brushed the warm plate, and I felt the weight of it, the way it contrasted with the generous portions the others received. I took it, with a steady smile, nodding politely, and tried to make my voice light when I said, "Thank you, Daniel." His eyes flicked to mine for a split second, a glimmer of uncertainty, but he quickly turned back to Emily. She was speaking with her mother, laughing at a story about a family vacation, and I realized with a sudden clarity that my presence here was almost incidental. I was part of the room, yet apart from it. The laughter, the conversation, the easy movement of people around the table. They all continued without me, and I was left holding the scraps, the remnants of a meal meant to celebrate abundance and family. I cut the turkey into smaller pieces, careful to arrange them neatly on my plate, but the ritual that had once been comforting now felt hollow. The mashed potatoes were fluffy and buttery, but I noticed the rich aroma and the golden crust of the bread served to the others, and my chest tightened. I could remember Daniel as a boy watching me carve turkey for him with eyes full of wonder, his small hands clapping in excitement. That same boy now handed me leftovers without hesitation, as if the love and effort of the past had no bearing on the present. I took a sip of water, my throat dry, and tried to focus on the warmth in the room, on the small comfort of the cranberry sauce that I had brought. Emily leaned across to her mother to share a joke, and I watched the sparkle in their eyes, a light I could not touch. Daniel's father complimented the turkey, praising the seasoning and how perfectly it had cooked, and I found myself smiling again, masking the ache in my chest. My fingers traced the edge of the plate, steadying myself against the sudden surge of emotion. The sounds of forks against plates, the murmur of voices, the laughter, they were all familiar. Yet I felt like a ghost moving among them. The scraps of turkey on my plate seemed emblematic of my place here, present, but unnoticed. I remembered the long years of early mornings of peeling potatoes, of serving meals with love, and I realized that the bond I had nurtured with Daniel had shifted. It wasn't gone, but it had been redefined in ways I hadn't anticipated, leaving me quietly adrift. I kept my expression calm, nodded at their conversation, and made polite comments when prompted. Daniel poured wine into Emily's glass, her mother's glass, his father's glass, while my cup remained untouched. I arranged the scraps on my plate, methodically eating each piece, and with every bite I felt the familiar ache of a love that had once been central, now edged with invisibility. By the time the meal drew to a close, I had maintained my composure, folding my napkin neatly and placing it beside the empty plate. No one had noticed my quiet endurance. Daniel cleared the table. Emily carried a tray of desserts for her parents, and I quietly slipped my hands into my lap, letting the weight of the moment settle around me. I knew then that my love, my efforts, and my sacrifices were invisible here. A quiet testament to the distance that had grown between us, and I carried that knowledge silently, like a stone pressed against my heart. As I cleared my plate and placed it gently on the edge of the counter, my mind drifted back to those years that had built the foundation of Daniel's life. The long nights, the aching muscles, the empty stomachs I silently endured, every detail came flooding back sharp and vivid. I remembered the first apartment we had rented together, a narrow space above a laundromat with windows that rattled when the wind blew. The rent consumed nearly everything I earned, but I never let Daniel feel the pinch. I worked mornings cleaning office floors, scrubbing tiles until my hands were raw and cracked. I carried heavy bags of supplies up endless flights of stairs, the ache in my back a constant companion. After a brief lunch, I returned to serving tables in a small diner until midnight, balancing trays and plates with the same care I later poured into every Thanksgiving meal. Exhaustion was familiar, yet I never complained in front of him. Daniel only ever saw the warmth and energy I managed to preserve, the faint sparkle I kept alive in my voice, so that he could feel safe, loved, and whole. Birthdays were another test of endurance. I sold my own small keepsakes, counted pennies, and scoured thrift stores to find something meaningful for him. I remember his 16th birthday vividly, how I stretched my paycheck to rent a small hall, buy balloons and decorations, and provide a cake that he would remember. His eyes shone under strings of cheap lights spinning in a dress rehearsal of joy that I had bought with my own sweat and careful calculations. I never told him how tight the budget was, how I had eaten peanut butter sandwiches for 3 days just to afford frosting, or how I had patched my winter coat for the 3rd year in a row so that his jacket would be warm enough. I remember sitting by the kitchen sink one evening counting change while he did his homework at the table, the hum of the apartment quiet except for his pencil scratching against paper. That tiny ritual balancing coins, ensuring rent and food were paid, was an act of love, an invisible labor that had shaped every moment of his childhood. Even the nights I fell asleep at my desk, a half-finished pie cooling in the oven, I felt a quiet satisfaction, knowing I had given him the tools to grow the stability to dream. Then came school fees, summer camps, and eventually college. Each step required another layer of sacrifice. I pawned jewelry I had treasured since my own youth, took out small loans against future paychecks, and spent every spare hour preparing him for a life I could barely imagine for myself. I endured sickness, fatigue, and loneliness in ways that never touched his world. He thrived, unaware of the small, silent storms I had weathered to keep him safe. Now sitting here at their elegant Thanksgiving table, watching Emily and her parents enjoy the golden turkey and creamy mashed potatoes, the contrast was painfully clear. The vibrant meals of my memory, stolen from exhaustion and worry, crafted with trembling hands and a heart full of devotion, had been replaced by a setting where my presence was almost incidental. I thought of all the long nights, all the careful budgeting, all the invisible work, and I realized that none of it mattered here, not in the way I had imagined it would. Yet even in that moment of exclusion, there was a quiet pride that persisted. I had built something enduring, even if its value was invisible to others. The sacrifices, the tireless labor, the endless love I had given it freely without expectation, and it had shaped a life that would carry forward regardless of recognition. That understanding was both comforting and painful, a testament to devotion that could endure even in silence, even in absence. And so I sat, hands folded in my lap, savoring the bittersweet memory of every meal I had prepared, every cold night I had endured every small victory that had built the man sitting across from me. Daniel thrived, and I had been the quiet architect of that life unseen, yet unyielding. The past wrapped around me like a familiar quilt, warm but heavy, reminding me of all that had been given and all that had been overlooked. The laughter at the table felt distant, almost foreign, as I watched Daniel pour another glass of wine for Emily's mother. Mrs. Reynolds smiled, her pearls catching the light from the chandelier, and leaned in to whisper something that made Emily laugh softly. Daniel's attention was completely absorbed, leaving me hovering on the edge of the room like a shadow. It hit me with sudden clarity I was no longer central to this life. The role I had played for 30-plus years, guide, caretaker, confidant, had quietly been reassigned. Emily's presence was steady, and commanding, her gestures polished and effortless. She moved through the space with ease, anticipating Daniel's needs, managing his parents, keeping the conversation flowing with practiced charm. Even the jokes that had once been ours, whispered across a table or shared over mashed potatoes, now seemed to orbit her instead of me. I took a sip of water, steadying my hands, and watched as Emily served Daniel's father, first placing generous slices of turkey and bright, buttery potatoes in front of him. Then she served herself and her mother, leaving Daniel to scoop a few pieces onto his plate, still laughing at a story his mother-in-law had told. I could feel the invisible line being drawn, the subtle boundaries that separated me from the warmth and laughter that once belonged to our small, chaotic world. For a moment, I imagined stepping forward, offering a comment, a joke, a word of advice, and then I caught myself. This was no longer my place. Emily's competence, Mrs. Reynolds's presence, and Daniel's eager compliance had created a rhythm I could not interrupt without seeming intrusive. The awareness stung sharply, a quiet ache deep in my chest. I had poured decades into building the foundation for this man's life, yet here in the very room I had hoped would celebrate me as a mother, I was peripheral. The cranberry sauce I had brought sat untouched, a silent testament to my efforts and my hope to connect. I reached out instinctively, adjusting the jar slightly on the table, but no one noticed. Emily's hands moved over the polished silver, her smile easy and unconcerned. Daniel laughed at a joke I didn't catch, and the room's energy swirled around me, leaving me anchored in a strange, dissonant stillness. I realized that this exclusion was not malicious. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, a natural shift as life moved on and priorities changed. Emily had claimed her place, and Daniel had accepted it without thought. Mrs. Reynolds was part of this world. Now her presence smoothing every corner, her guidance shaping every decision. And I, Harper Wainwright, was the woman who had raised the man before him, now standing silently, watching from a distance. There was no dramatic confrontation, no raised voices, no pointed glares. It was quieter than that, more absolute. The acceptance of my marginalization settled in my chest, heavy but clear. I could feel the years of sacrifice, the nights spent cleaning floors, the hours hunched over homework, the painstaking attention to each meal I prepared, all being reframed in this new arrangement. My devotion had been constant, but it was no longer relevant here. The life I had built for Daniel existed around him, not with him. I folded my hands in my lap, keeping my expression calm while my heart throbbed with the bittersweet weight of understanding. I would remain silently present, but not central. The shift was complete, undeniable, and in that quiet acknowledgement, I found the first trace of a different kind of clarity, a realization that to move forward, I would need to step back, to redefine what my role meant, and to consider the life I would claim for myself. The decision came slowly, quietly, like a whisper that grew stronger with every passing day. I found myself sitting at the kitchen table in my small, aging apartment, staring at the stack of bills I had kept meticulously organized, and the memories that clung to the walls like dust. For decades, this space had been the center of my life, the backdrop for every holiday, every scraped knee, every small triumph and private joy. It had sheltered Daniel, nurtured him, and yet now I realized it held me back. I picked up a pen and began jotting numbers in my ledger, considering options I had never allowed myself to entertain. The home I had worked tirelessly to maintain, the apartment where countless Thanksgivings had been celebrated with scraped-together meals and triumphant laughter, could be sold. The thought stung at first, a pang of guilt twisting through my chest, but it also brought a strange sense of relief. This space full of memories no longer defined me, and it no longer contained the family I had built it for. As the morning sunlight fell across the countertop, warming the faint scent of coffee that lingered from my early shift, I realized that independence would not come from clinging to old walls or familiar routines. It would come from action, from choosing myself without apology. I contacted a real estate agent I had known years ago, a quiet woman named Louise, who specialized in modest Portland homes. She listened patiently as I explained my intent, her eyes soft with understanding rather than surprise. There was no judgment in her voice, only the clarity that this was a necessary step, a reclaiming of space and self. Once the paperwork was in motion, my thoughts turned to a new purpose, a way to ensure that my labor and devotion could have lasting meaning beyond the confines of my own life. I began sketching plans for a small foundation, modest but solid, dedicated to women who had sacrificed endlessly for others. Mothers, daughters, caretakers, women whose lives had been spent in service, their worth measured only by what they could give. The foundation would offer mentorship, resources, and community, a tangible acknowledgement that such sacrifices were not invisible, and that those who gave so much deserved recognition, dignity, and support. I found a small office, downtown sunlight pouring through large windows, and met with a lawyer to draw up the initial documents. The process was methodical, deliberate, and it grounded me. Every signature, every clause, every decision was a step toward reclaiming agency. There was no room for resentment, no space for anger, only the quiet, resolute acknowledgement that I had the right to define my life on my own terms. Selling the home was not easy emotionally. I walked through each room one last time, touching the worn countertops and scratched floors, recalling years of toil, laughter, and small victories. Each corner carried a memory of Daniel, of the early mornings, the scraped knees, the shared pies, and whispered stories. And yet, as I turned the key in the lock for the final time, a strange lightness lifted within me. I was leaving behind not just walls, but the weight of expectation, the invisible chains of unacknowledged devotion. The foundation became the symbol of my choice. I envisioned a place where women like me could find encouragement, resources, and validation not tied to family, not contingent on recognition, but rooted in their inherent worth. I thought of the many evenings I had spent alone, cooking, cleaning, giving, and wondered how many of those small sacrifices could now ripple outward, inspiring strength and solidarity. That evening, as I settled into a quiet apartment that was finally entirely mine, I felt a rare sense of peace. I had acted decisively and without hesitation, reclaiming my space, my dignity, and my future. The decision was not about revenge or judgment, but about autonomy, about the courage to prioritize oneself when love and labor had been overlooked. And in that moment, I understood that the life I had built for others had led me to the moment I could finally build one for myself. The drive down Highway 101 was quiet, the rhythm of the tires over the asphalt matching the slower beat of my thoughts. Portland receded behind me, its urban hum fading into the distance, replaced by stretches of evergreen forest and glimpses of the Pacific sparkling under the morning sun. I had rented a small, modest house in a coastal town just south of the city, a place I had never imagined for myself, but now felt inexplicably drawn to. The house was simple: 2 bedrooms, a living room, with a fireplace and a porch that creaked when the wind caught it just right. A small swing hung from the corner, and a patch of wild lavender grew along the fence, resilient and fragrant. It wasn't much, and it wasn't luxurious, but it belonged entirely to me. Every detail, from the faded doorknob to the uneven floorboards, was part of a space I could call my own, free from the expectations, judgments, and history of the life I had left behind. I carried the boxes inside slowly, one by one, pausing to breathe in the salty air drifting through the open windows. The sound of gulls overhead and waves crashing in the distance felt like a balm softening the ache that had built over decades of service devotion and overlooked sacrifice. I set down the last box in the living room, the one filled with cookbooks and old photographs of Daniel as a boy. I allowed myself a brief smile, placing the images on a small shelf. They were a part of my history, yes, but they no longer dictated the contours of my life. Unpacking became an exercise in deliberate patience. I arranged the kitchen just as I liked it, each plate and utensil, finding a home without compromise. The bedroom, stripped of excess, felt airy and calm. I draped a blanket over the chair by the window, imagining myself curled up there with a book and a cup of tea, while the ocean whispered outside. The simplicity of the home allowed for clarity, a gentle rhythm that had been absent in the bustling, polished world of Daniel and Emily. That evening, I stood on the porch, leaning against the railing, watching the sun dip into the horizon. The sky was streaked with gold and crimson, the kind of display that seemed both infinite and intimate at the same time. I felt a quiet pride in myself, a recognition that I had earned this peace, this autonomy, and that it was something no one could take away. The coastal breeze carried a saltiness that seemed to strip away the last remnants of anxiety, leaving only calm, reflective space. I walked through the house again, checking each room, letting my fingers brush the edges of counters and shelves, committing every detail to memory. This was the first time in a long while that I felt wholly at home in a space without compromise. No one's expectations were pressing down on me. No one's judgment lurked in corners. Here I could breathe, think, and act for myself. Even as night fell, the sound of the ocean remained steady, a constant companion in a life that had finally slowed enough for me to notice. I placed a candle on the mantel and let its soft light fill the living room. Shadows danced across the walls, and I imagined a life unfolding here, quiet mornings with the sun spilling across the floor, evenings spent writing or painting, and the occasional visitor who would be welcomed without expectation, just shared warmth. As I closed the door behind me that first night, I felt a sense of closure and anticipation intertwined. I had left a life of sacrifice and invisibility behind, stepping into one that was entirely my own. The air smelled of salt pine and possibility. For the first time in decades, I could hear myself think, feel, and breathe in a space that was wholly and indisputably mine. The sign on the door read, "Community Art Studio. All levels welcome." And I hesitated for a moment, clutching my tote bag filled with brushes and paints. It had been decades since I had held a brush in my hand, since I had allowed myself the luxury of creating for nothing but the sheer pleasure of it. But the quiet house, the wind off the ocean, and the sense of ownership over my own life gave me courage I hadn't known I still possessed. The studio was bright and welcoming, with sunlight spilling through large windows and the faint smell of turpentine and canvas in the air. A dozen women were scattered across tables, some sketching with quiet concentration, others chatting as they brushed colors across paper. I found an empty seat near the back and set up my supplies, fingers trembling slightly as I selected my colors. A woman with soft gray hair and kind eyes smiled at me from across the table. First time she asked, her voice gentle, "Don't worry, we all start somewhere." Her name was Magda, and as we talked quietly while setting up our workspaces, I learned she had survived breast cancer and now painted to reclaim pieces of her life that had been stolen by illness. I nodded, feeling a kinship in our unspoken understanding, the quiet strength it takes to rebuild oneself. Another woman, Rut, had raised 5 children and only now had time to explore her own passions. She laughed easily, her hands already stained with colors, telling stories of long nights caring for her family, of birthdays and meals, prepared with love of dreams put aside until now. Each story resonated with me, a mirror of my own life, and I realized that I was not alone in the mixture of sacrifice, exhaustion, and lingering desire for self-expression. When the instructor began the session, I hesitated, but as soon as the brush touched the canvas, a small spark ignited within me. The colors felt alive, blending and bleeding in ways I had forgotten could be beautiful. The first strokes were shaky, uncertain, but as I continued, I allowed myself to relax, to let the brush guide me instead of my cautious mind. Laughter from Rut and Magda punctuated the room, the gentle teasing and encouragement, creating a rhythm that eased my self-consciousness. I lost track of time as I painted, immersed in a world where mistakes were part of the process, where judgment did not exist, and the only measure was my own engagement with the canvas. The stress of the past, the ache of years spent unseen, melted into the act of creation. Each stroke became a small reclamation, a declaration that I was allowed to exist, to express, to take space. By the end of the session, I stepped back and surveyed my work. The shapes were imperfect, the colors not entirely blended, but they carried life and energy in a way I had not felt in years. I felt a thrill, a mixture of pride and liberation, and I realized that this simple act of painting had awakened something long dormant, joy, not borrowed or imposed, but fully, completely mine. Magda and Rut came over offering small compliments and genuine smiles. We talked about our plans, our families, the little victories of creating despite exhaustion and age. The connection, the shared understanding of what it meant to give so much to others and finally take a moment for oneself was profound. For the first time in decades, I felt seen, not because I had served, cared, or sacrificed, but because I existed and expressed myself in a space where I belonged. Walking home along the coastal road, the sun dipping toward the horizon, I felt a lightness I had not known in years. The wind carried the salty scent of the ocean, mixing with the faint residue of paint on my hands, a reminder of both the day's labor and the pleasure I had claimed. I had reconnected with a part of myself that had been waiting patiently. And I knew that this was only the beginning. The joy of creating the laughter shared with women who understood and the freedom to explore had reignited something I thought I had lost forever. The community center smelled faintly of cleaning solution and autumn leaves, but Harper didn't mind. She had spent the morning arranging tables, placing mismatched but carefully chosen plates, and folding napkins into little triangles that reminded her of Thanksgiving mornings long ago with Daniel. The room was modest with a low ceiling and fluorescent lights, yet it radiated a warmth Harper had never expected to find. Guests began to arrive, and each new face carried a story. There was Helen, a retired nurse whose children had moved across the country, Carl, a widower who had outlived both his siblings, and Maya, a young single mother struggling to make ends meet. Harper greeted each person with a smile and a gentle handshake, listening as they shared snippets of their lives, their laughter and quiet smiles weaving an invisible thread through the room. She set the cranberry sauce her hands steady, despite the flutter of nerves. It was homemade, rich with berries and spice, just like the one she had brought for Daniel in his new home years ago. She placed it at the center of the table, surrounded by dishes. Others had contributed casseroles, roasted vegetables, pies that gleamed with golden crusts. The table was a mosaic of effort, care, and generosity, each contribution a symbol of belonging. Harper guided her guests to their seats, making small introductions and encouraging conversation. The room soon hummed with chatter and laughter, a comforting rhythm that felt both familiar and new. She watched Carl offer a plate to Maya, noting the way his hands trembled slightly with age, and she felt a surge of warmth. These were people who had known loneliness, exclusion, or loss, and here at this table, they were seen. When the turkey was carried in steaming and golden, Harper took a deep breath, recalling the countless times she had performed this same ritual for Daniel carving, serving, ensuring every detail reflected love. Today, she was not alone. Every slice she placed on a plate was met with gratitude, smiles, and a sense of shared delight. There was no hierarchy, no obligation, no weight of expectation. The only measure was the joy reflected in each person's eyes. As the meal progressed, conversations flowed freely. Stories of childhood mischief, lost opportunities, and quiet triumphs mingled with laughter over spilled gravy and slightly overcooked vegetables. Harper listened occasionally, contributing a word or two, but mostly observing the connections that formed naturally, like threads in a tapestry. She realized that she was no longer the one striving to maintain a family. Instead, she was a part of something created, collectively chosen freely by everyone at the table. After dessert, Harper leaned back and looked around. There were no polished floors or sparkling chandeliers, no perfect napkin folds or formalities. Yet the energy of the room was vibrant, alive with care and presence. She felt a profound sense of fulfillment, recognizing that family did not have to be dictated by blood. It could be constructed from shared experiences, mutual respect, and the simple decision to be present for one another. As the evening wound down, guests lingered, lingering in conversation, or quietly helping to tidy up. Harper felt a quiet satisfaction settle into her chest. She had not only prepared a meal, she had cultivated belonging, a circle of people who chose each other, and in doing so had chosen her as well. The weight of her past sacrifices, while never forgotten, no longer defined her sense of value. Here in this modest room, she was appreciated, needed, and accepted exactly as she was. By the time the last guest departed, Harper stood by the window watching the early evening sky fade into twilight. She touched the smooth surface of the counter, a smile tugging at her lips. In this small, self-created family, she had found warmth, laughter, and connection that neither years nor distance could diminish. Sitting in the quiet of her small coastal home, Harper traced her fingers along the edges of her painting supplies, the soft hum of the ocean outside a gentle counterpoint to the thoughts swirling in her mind. She thought of the years spent raising Daniel, the long nights, the endless labor, the Thanksgiving feasts, prepared with trembling hands and unwavering devotion. She had given so much, her energy, her time, her own comfort, without asking for recognition. And yet, when it came, the acknowledgement she had hoped for never arrived. She reflected on the countless ways she had measured love through action. Every scraped knee, every homework assignment completed, every birthday celebrated on a shoestring budget had been offered freely without calculation. She had believed that devotion alone could guarantee understanding, appreciation, and the warmth of returned love. But life had taught her otherwise. Daniel's polite but distant manner at his new home, the unspoken hierarchy at the Thanksgiving table, Emily's ease in commanding attention. These things revealed that love, no matter how genuine, could be overlooked, misread, or displaced. Harper understood now that what she had offered was unconditional, yet her expectations had been silent and innate. She had never demanded recognition, but she had hoped it would follow naturally, as if love were a transaction that balanced itself. Yet real love, she realized, does not operate like a ledger. It does not measure sacrifice with returns, nor does it keep score of quiet nights endured or meals prepared. True love manifests in presence, in acknowledgement of being, and in acts that affirm value without expecting recompense. She thought about the contrast she had observed over the years. Families who weighed affection against accomplishments, friendships, contingent on usefulness, gratitude reserved for those who could provide. Transactional love, while common, lacked the depth and resilience of the kind she had offered freely. It was conditional, fragile, and often dependent on circumstance. Her devotion had been free of such limitations, but it had collided with the world's inclination to reward visible, measurable contributions, leaving her work invisible, her labor unappreciated, and her heart quietly bruised. And yet, sitting here, Harper felt no bitterness. There was clarity in this understanding. Love cannot be defined by recognition alone, nor diminished when it is unacknowledged. Her sacrifices, her nights spent exhausted, yet determined, her endless giving had shaped a life and a son who carried her teachings, her values, her sense of care. Even if the gestures were unseen, they had created ripples that shaped someone she loved deeply. The thought brought a quiet smile to her lips. She realized that love's true measure is not in reciprocation or praise, but in the act of giving itself. It is found in the intention, in the constancy, and in the integrity of heart that sustains it. She could give fully and yet step back, knowing that her value was inherent, not dependent on external approval. The foundation she had begun to build for women like her became an extension of this realization, a space where giving and sacrifice were recognized, supported, and celebrated not as currency, but as proof of resilience and courage. Harper leaned back in her chair, eyes drifting to the waves breaking against the shore. She felt the weight of decades, both heavy and luminous, carrying the lessons of devotion, disappointment, and understanding. The quiet of the evening allowed her to absorb a truth she had long overlooked. Love given freely without expectation carries its own enduring reward. It does not demand acknowledgement, but it leaves a lasting imprint, shaping hearts and lives in ways both subtle and profound. She exhaled slowly, a sense of calm settling in her chest. The ocean continued its steady rhythm, a reminder that life, like love, flows forward, sometimes measured in small gestures, sometimes in the vastness of what is shared and unseen. Harper knew finally that she had loved well, and that was enough. The mornings had taken on a new rhythm, one that belonged entirely to me. I woke when I wanted poured coffee into my favorite mug and watched the light spill across the living room floor. There was no rush to meet deadlines, no quiet panic about bills, no anxious calculation of how to stretch the next paycheck. The independence I had claimed after selling my old apartment had settled around me like a warm, protective blanket, and I could finally breathe in a life fully my own. I spent time tending to the small garden outside my porch, trimming the lavender and planting hardy winter blooms. My hands, calloused from years of work, now moved with gentle intention rather than necessity. I noticed the details I had often ignored before: the way the ocean glimmered under early sunlight, the subtle scents of pine and salt in the air, the faint rustle of leaves as the wind passed through the neighborhood. Life had slowed, and in that slowing, I found a clarity I hadn't realized I was missing. Financial freedom came in its own quiet satisfaction. I managed my budget carefully, yes, but the worry that had once threaded through every decision was gone. The foundation I had established to support women who had sacrificed for others provided both purpose and security, and my savings grew in a way that was deliberate and empowering. I no longer measured my worth by how much I could give to someone else or how indispensable I could be. I measured it by the way I nurtured my own life, my own peace, and my own fulfillment. Evenings became mine to structure. I could paint, write in my journal, or simply sit on the porch watching the horizon shift from gold to crimson to the deep navy of night. Sometimes I invited a neighbor for tea, someone with a story to share, or a quiet presence to offer, and the small acts of connection felt chosen rather than required. I discovered that the weight of expectation I had carried for decades, the unspoken demands of others, the silent need to be constantly available and selfless, was no longer part of my life. I thought of Daniel, of Emily, of the polite distance at the Thanksgiving table, and I felt a sense of peace rather than resentment. My love for him had never wavered, but I no longer tied my happiness to his recognition, his choices, or his attention. I had learned that autonomy was not just a privilege, but a necessity, a space where one could flourish without bending to the invisible pressures of obligation. In this new life, I found joy in small, deliberate acts, stirring a pot of soup, just because I wanted to reading a book that had nothing to do with responsibility, taking long walks along the shore without checking a clock or worrying about anyone else's schedule. These were freedoms I had once taken for granted in theory, but had never truly experienced in practice. The more I embraced this independence, the more I realized that happiness was not defined by how others measured me, by the expectations placed upon me, or by the gratitude I received. It was defined by the choices I made, by the attention I gave to my own growth, my own passions, and my own peace. Each day was a confirmation that I could live fully, intentionally, and with a sense of agency I had never allowed myself before. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a soft pink glow over the ocean, I stood on my porch and felt the subtle satisfaction of a life well claimed. I had created boundaries, honored my needs, and cultivated a world that reflected my priorities. Independence, I realized, was not just the absence of obligation. It was the presence of choice, of control, and of the quiet, enduring happiness that comes from living entirely on one's own terms. The phone rang softly on the kitchen counter, the ringtone, a familiar tune I had long associated with Daniel. I picked it up, expecting the warmth of his voice, perhaps a casual check-in, or the subtle nostalgia of an old habit. "Hi, Mom," he said, voice careful and measured. I need to ask a favor. Something small about the house." I listened as he explained a minor plumbing issue, a loose railing, something that could wait for any competent handyman, but had fallen to the top of his mind. He was polite, deferential, and hesitant all at once, as if he were testing the waters, unsure how my distance would be received. I could hear Emily murmuring in the background, perhaps offering advice, guiding his words, shaping his tone. I nodded, though he could not see me, and responded calmly. "I can give you the contact for a reliable plumber in the area. You don't need to involve me directly." My voice was steady, measured, free from judgment or frustration. I felt the familiar tug of instinct, the part of me that had always wanted to swoop in, to fix, to provide. But this time, I allowed it to pass, replacing it with quiet self-restraint. He hesitated for a moment, then said, "I know you've done so much over the years, and I really appreciate it, Mom." I smiled softly, though he couldn't see, and let the words settle without comment. The acknowledgement was fleeting, incomplete, but enough to remind me of the bond we had always shared. I didn't need more. I had already chosen my path. As the conversation continued, Daniel asked a few questions about the foundation, curious about how things were progressing. I shared lightly, keeping the details measured, emphasizing the work of the women we were helping, rather than any personal validation. His interest was genuine, but brief a glance across the table rather than a sustained gaze. It was enough to satisfy curiosity, but it reinforced the subtle boundary I had drawn. My life existed independently of his needs or approval. I could sense a shift in him, a quiet recognition that I had changed. He paused, then added, "I hope everything's going well." "You sound happy." There it was. The thing I had wanted not from him, but from myself. The acknowledgement that I had built a life on my own terms, that I was thriving, beyond the shadows of past expectations. "I am," I replied simply, letting the word carry its weight without elaboration. When he hung up, I sat back in my chair, feeling the familiar pulse of satisfaction that comes from acting with both love and restraint. I had listened, offered guidance when needed, and maintained the space I had carved out for myself. There was no resentment, no sense of being overlooked, only a quiet confidence in the balance I had achieved. Later that evening, I walked along the edge of the coastal road, the ocean stretching wide before me. The waves whispered against the shore, a steady rhythm that mirrored the calm I had cultivated within. The conversation with Daniel replayed in my mind, not as a source of tension, but as confirmation I could care, I could engage, and still honor my own needs. I could respond without overextending myself, without allowing old patterns of self-sacrifice to dictate the present. The realization settled over me like a soft tide. Love did not require surrender. Devotion did not demand compromise of self. I had listened, guided, and offered support, and yet I remained fully present in my own life, unshaken by old expectations. For the first time, the balance between heart and boundary felt effortless, natural, and sustaining. The community hall buzzed with warmth and laughter as I carried the last tray of roasted vegetables to the long table. Candles flickered gently along the center, casting a soft glow on faces lined with stories of struggle, perseverance, and quiet victories. These were the people I had chosen as my family, not by blood, but by shared understanding, respect, and a willingness to be present for one another. I took a moment to watch them. Helen, with her soft gray hair, was telling a story about a Thanksgiving long ago when her own children had forgotten to call. Carl chuckled at her memory, nodding with the wisdom of decades lived fully, but alone. Maya, a young mother, smiled shyly as others passed her plates of food. She had no time to prepare herself. Every gesture, every glance, every shared laugh built a tapestry of belonging that was rich and complete. I moved along the table, placing the cranberry sauce in the center where everyone could reach it. Its deep red hue reminded me of years past, of small kitchens and scraped floors, of long nights of preparation for Daniel, of the love that had gone unnoticed but never diminished. Here, it mattered. Here, each dish carried not only nourishment, but the weight of recognition, acknowledgement, and shared care. The chatter rose and fell like gentle waves. People complimented each other's contributions, teased and joked, and for the first time in decades, I felt no invisible burden pressing against my chest. I could laugh freely, share stories, and participate fully, knowing that the connections here were chosen reciprocal and unforced. Each moment reinforced the truth I had learned over the years. Family could be built, nurtured, and sustained by intent and love, not solely by blood. As the meal drew to a close, I paused at the head of the table, looking around at the smiling faces. The room hummed with contentment, a harmony born of acceptance and care. I felt a profound sense of peace settle into me. The long years of sacrifice, the quiet labor, the invisible nights and unnoticed gestures, all had led me here, not to the recognition I had once sought, but to fulfillment born of autonomy, purpose, and chosen bonds. That night, as I walked home under the soft glow of the streetlights and the distant sound of the ocean, I carried with me a sense of completion. The laughter, the gratitude, and the warmth I had cultivated in this circle affirmed that happiness, belonging, and love could indeed be defined by choice. I smiled softly, feeling the lightness of a life fully claimed, and for the first time in decades, I knew that I was exactly where I was meant to be.